What's up? How you doing today? I am David Long. As per usual, I put out a new video and there's Bruce Alderman making some kind of, well, actually type of comment on it. Let's just jump straight into his criticism. He says, David, your challenge has several significant issues that undermine its credibility or impact. And he goes on to list 3 things. So we're going to go through these 3 things. The first thing is, you say you agree with idealists when they say that we only know the world through our senses. The claim that we only know the world through our senses is foundationally an empirical one, not an idealist one. Look back to the work of Locke or Bacon on this. It's a claim made in opposition to the other prominent philosophies of the time, such as rationalism and skepticism. Rationalism, for instance, argues that the true knowledge of the world can be obtained through thinking alone, through the direct and principled apprehension of clear and distinct ideas. But the early founders of science and the scientific method were skeptical of this, arguing that whatever we know of the world comes through our senses first, and it is because of the sensory basis of our knowledge of the world that experimentation and testing is necessary. Senses can be fallible, so we need methods of testing our sensory observations. The very scientific method comes out of this claim, out of this objection to the rationalism of folks like Descartes. The idealist Berkeley picked up this emergent argument and then used it to cast doubt on the empiricist claim that there is a fundamental difference between the primary and secondary qualities. Those which can be experimentally measured and those which cannot be are merely subjective. Berkeley tried to argue that all qualities are subjective and therefore idealism is true. However, this argument didn't carry the day, and science continued to develop the core empiricist argument that senses, and therefore controlled experiments, are necessary to be able to discern primary properties of objects, their objective status, from secondary, immuted subjective ones. Well, okay, Professor, thanks for bloviating on this topic and demonstrating your philosophical knowledge of the nuances of all of these particular characters' specific arguments. It's a lot of name dropping and explaining, but it seems to actually completely miss the point. All of these people and their ideas are developing out of traditionalism into early rationality. So yeah, you're going to have a broad spectrum of ideas. The project is kind of the same, just trying to figure out what's actually true. It's just that some people have different methodologies and some people are actually better at achieving these things in a more reasonable way, which is why for a while the empiricist argument won the day. Yeah, it won the day over the idealist thinking. It didn't win the day forever as the final position. So regardless of the vast spectrum of ideas that were happening at this stage, let's get down to the actual point here. What are we really talking about? We're talking about if your idea is reasonable. Is it rational? Which means applying rational standards. But you can make the ground up case in any way you want. Start from the epistemic primary up to your ontological or cosmological conclusion, because that's what we're talking about. I'm not even demanding evidence. I'm just saying, if you want to claim that a perspective or a philosophical conclusion is rational, you have to be able to at least demonstrate that you can make a logical case for your view. You shouldn't have a problem with this project. Don't get so fixated on whether I'm claiming that we only know the world through our senses. What I'm really trying to say as the foundation is that you can't doubt that you exist. Whatever we know is from our subjective experience. To claim that it is sense data is actually coming from steps ahead, from the point of establishing science, reframing it as sense data with a better ontological and cosmological knowledge of what is going on at that lower level of the case. But if I'm building my ground up case, I'm not necessarily making the claim that it's sense data of the world. I'm just saying that whatever we know from our subjective perspective. And really, at the bottom, I'm saying that all we can really know is that we exist, that we're having an experience. There is some phenomenological experience, whether that means that other people exist, or there's an external reality, or that we know what our consciousness is. None of that has been established yet. So let's say an idealist wants to build a ground up case for idealism. They want to think that it's a rational case, but they want to start from this perspective of all I know is my own experience. If they don't want to say that there is an outside world, I don't know how they're going to say that they arrived at that conclusion in a reasonable way. How did they come to the conclusion that it was more than just them? How did they get past solipsism to realize that there's other minds in this mind at large? How do you get from this epistemic primary of all I know is that I exist to come to a firm conclusion about idealism? Because you're not doing that by establishing science and coming to those conclusions. The logic that leads you to that conclusion isn't good. At best, you're still stuck in inductive theoretical space. But at that point, you basically have little to no ground to stand on at all about anything. And you definitely shouldn't be making claims about it. If you value rationality or epistemic humility, you have to say that idealism is off the table, because that's an unfounded claim about the absolute nature of reality, about what transcends the natural that nobody has any evidence for. So it could not possibly be an epistemically humble claim. So in short, it doesn't matter. I'm not even specifically making the claim that he's saying that I'm making. What I'm really saying is that you at least have to be able to make a logical case for your conclusions, for your ideas to be considered rational. But I would definitely like to see a ground-up case that demonstrates the validity of your methodology to arrive at your conclusions. And if you have a problem with that project, then you don't value truth, you don't value rationality, and you don't value epistemic humility. You don't value standards around speech and what is said. You don't value truth enough, you don't value goodness enough. It's a serious problem. Number 2, you argue that emergentism is a falsifiable theory, whereas other approaches like panpsychism are just wishful thinking metaphysics. Emergentism is a philosophical theory, not a scientific one. On that ground, it is on par with panpsychism, dual aspect monism, and other theories within the philosophy of mind. This doesn't mean that panpsychism currently has the same standing within philosophy of mind that emergentism does. It doesn't. But you falsely claim that emergentism is a scientific theory, i.e. a falsifiable one, as opposed to these other orientations. But emergentism currently is not considered a scientific theory because it is not subject to the same criteria of testability and falsifiability that apply to scientific theories. Emergentism posits that complex systems and patterns can arise from the interaction of similar components, but it does not provide a specific mechanism. This is the creationist straw man that I was talking about. The specific mechanism or process that can be tested to confirm or disprove its claims. It also states that the properties that emerge in complex systems cannot be reduced to or explained by the properties of individual components alone, which makes it hard to make specific predictions about what should be observed in a given scenario. Consciousness is a complex and multifaceted phenomenon, and it is not yet clear how one would design an experiment to test the emergentist theory of consciousness in a rigorous or controlled manner. For these reasons, emergentism is considered a philosophical theory, a conceptual framework for making sense of data. If you look in the philosophy of science as opposed to the philosophy of mind, you will find that emergentism is not the unquestioned orientation. In certain fields of science, for instance, reductionism is still the preferred approach. Many physicists regard emergentism, not just of consciousness, but of any fundamental new order of phenomenon, still as woo, lacking proper scientific status or robustness. Okay, so he makes the distinction between a philosophical theory and a scientific theory. And I'm going to say that basically this is a distinction between inductive and deductive reasoning. And he's doing this where's the mechanism thing. I talked about the problem with all of these ideas in my last video, but I'll go over some of it again. Let me be very clear that there is a difference between a philosophical theory or inductive reasoning and a scientific theory or deductive reasoning. This is an important distinction because a valid scientific theory trumps inductive reasoning. For example, you will often hear these idealists appealing to something like parsimony, which actually doesn't really support idealism because solipsism is more parsimonious. To just think only you exist is less complicated. Idealism, it's extra steps, it's extra stuff, and it postulates unnecessary outside entities. So idealism can't be a more parsimonious view than solipsism or just hard agnosticism. Again, it's a huge leap to jump from the epistemic primary, or the least that we could know, to claims about the ultimate truth of nature and what consciousness really is. That's part of why I'm asking for a ground-up case, because it becomes very clear that they're just making a giant leap, which again is something I've already talked about. So let me explain to you why deductive reasoning trumps inductive reasoning. I made this case already in my long argument with Rasmus over this point. This was one of the main problems with his argument. So let's say you come up to your car, the window is broken, and your phone is missing from where it was on the charger. The parsimonious assumption is to think that someone broke your window, stole your phone, and left. That's probably what you'd be thinking. But let's say someone comes up to you and says that they saw what happened, and that actually somebody playing baseball across the street hit the ball and it came in and it broke your window. And a dog that was standing close by jumped in after the ball and grabbed the ball and your cell phone and jumped out of the window and ran off with it. That is obviously a much more complicated explanation of what happened. And maybe you would be less likely to believe that than the first story. But if we find out that your car is parked in front of a store or an ATM that has a camera, and then we watch it back and we see what happened, even if the story about the baseball and the dog is more complicated and convoluted than the simple explanation of the thief, we're still going to go with the more complicated answer because we have the actual evidence for knowing what really happened. So this is why the deductive reasoning and the scientific theory trump the inductive philosophical theory, because we actually have evidence to support emergentism, and idealists and panpsychists can't actually make a falsifiable, testable case for their view. Not only can they not make a logical ground-up case that is reasonable, that stands for how they come to their conclusions, they also can't test or falsify those ideas. And in general, I'm going to say it's really unreasonable to try and interpret data in the light of views that you can't even make a logical case for. If you can't make a good logical case for why we should think that position X is true, then it shouldn't be in the running with other theories of interpretation. There are more criteria for inductive reasoning than just primacy. You also want explanatory power and falsifiability. So these ideas don't really even rise to the level of a serious, even philosophical theory. So let me deal with this claim that emergentism isn't falsifiable. It is falsifiable. Here's how you falsify it. If you can show that there are properties that exist without the equipment that is necessary to give rise to those functions, then you can falsify and disprove emergentism. If it is equipment that allows for certain functions, then if you don't have that equipment, according to emergentism, you don't get those functions. So if you could show any clue of those functions without the equipment, then you will have falsified emergentism. This is also why I've asked the panpsychists to give any good reason to think that non-living stuff has consciousness. So there you go. It is falsifiable. Their ideas are not. I can make a ground-up case for my view. Where are they able to do that? Can they do that? Can they even prove that it's a logical, viable position? Where's the ground-up case? Let's see it. Put it on the table, Bruce. All right, point 1, irrelevant. Point 2, incorrect. Let's get to point 3, shall we? His last very good and important point. Number 3, you misuse the God of the gaps and argument from ignorant criticisms, and your definition of rationality appears to be too narrow and scientific, not clearly differentiating between philosophical and scientific theories, or appreciating their distinct but complementary roles. No, I am making those distinctions. I have just explained that. And we're not talking about something purely scientific. We're talking first and foremost about logic. Can you make a ground up logical case for your view? So that doesn't stand. And we'll get into the God of the gaps and the misuse of the argument from ignorant criticism here in a second. He says, we currently don't have a clear test for measuring or verifying the presence or existence of consciousness itself. There are several tests that are currently used for human subjects, like the gastrocoma scale or fMRI measurements, But as of yet, we don't have any means of determining the presence of consciousness in many non-human life forms, because we don't know exactly what correlates to look for and aren't sure whether the known correlates are definitive or not, or for detecting consciousness itself, if there is any such thing as consciousness itself. This limitation is why both emergentism and panpsychism, among other options, remain philosophical theories, not scientific ones. I think what it actually means is there are many potential viable interpretations of emergentism. There are many potentially viable materialistic or physicalist or realist, however you want to say it, interpretations of the fact of emergence. And part of what an integral or meta-theoretical non-reductionist approach to emergentism has to also include is the lower left component that many physicalists are not taking into account. For example, consciousness cannot be reduced purely to hardware. There's also a software component or a translation component. So it's not just that there's body and experience, there's body and interpretation and experience. But again, this theory is scientific, it's falsifiable. Even if I today was able to come up with a reformulation of emergentism that has not yet been crystallized, let's say, in the way that I would do it, it would be a valid scientific theory because it would be a valid interpretation of the science that is falsifiable. Let's forget about consensus in the field and whether we can get everyone to agree. Let's agree that right now together we can do science and achieve a good theory. So the point is, if you are going to make claims like your cosmological view is reasonable, you need to be able to demonstrate that. Now, hey, maybe you're the first person in history to be able to do it in a really good way. And then I'll be like, dang, I'm surprised that you were able to do that. But what you can't argue with is that if you're going to make those kinds of claims and say that your perspective is reasonable, you need to be able to back that up with a ground up case, with at least a logically valid case, if not a scientific case. Back to it. He says, this is not a God of the gaps argument, nor an argument from ignorance. This in particular is not a God of the gaps argument, nor an argument from ignorance. And the reason it's not is because he's not pointing to this lack of evidence as a justification for these views. But it does seem to be unreasonable to say that these views would be rational views if you can't even make a logical case for them. This is not a God in the gaps argument, nor an argument from ignorance. For one, I accept both emergentism and panpsychism as viable approaches and possibly complementary ones. Even if there is some basic elemental prehension present in non-living or prebiotic entities, it is still likely that that elemental interiority develops through emergent stages, just as physical forms do. But more basically, we can entertain multiple different philosophical frameworks on rational grounds. Well, if you can actually demonstrate that they're on rational grounds, then I would agree with you if we didn't already have good deductive scientific evidence as a valid theory. Because, as I already said, a valid theory trumps inductive logic. There is not just one rational choice, as you appear to be arguing. It's interesting to me that he has a problem with me arguing that there's just one rational choice, but he doesn't have a problem with Integral out here boldly claiming that idealism is true because traditions maintain. He more vehemently goes after my claim about what a rational position is than he does about these bold, unfounded, unjustified, religiously based claims that absolutely cannot possibly be in line with epistemic humility. He should really have to acknowledge that point. He says here, I accept both emergentism and panpsychism as viable approaches. Well, then at least meet me here, Bruce. Let's shake hands on the idea that idealism is absolutely an epistemic overstep and cannot possibly be in line with epistemic humility. Meet me there. And then let's debate further emergentism versus panpsychism. But if that's the case, if what I'm saying is a rational, plausible thing, and what they're saying is an epistemic overstep, then why Do you constantly go after me and try to discredit me and constantly stand by and try and validate them? What is wrong with you, Bruce? What is wrong with your priorities, man? How can you be an academic authority who cares about integral intellectual integrity and stand by them and stand against me? It is shameful. You should be ashamed of yourself, man. You're on the wrong side of history, my dude. You stood in the way of progress over and over and over again in alignment with some cult of personality. Every time I make a video, there's Bruce being like, well, actually, hold on a second, sonny boy. Let me tell you, I am the integral professor who is saying, I don't know, you're not quite up to the mark. Always coming after me for everything that I do. And yet he'll go on to defend integral over and over and over again. He'll come to bat for them. And they are out here making these bold, unfounded claims that cannot possibly be in line with epistemic humility. He sides with that, with these bold, unfounded claims, and he's constantly criticizing me, the person who demands that our ideas be reasonably grounded and wants to have healthy boundaries and refine these ideas and make them open to the public so we can all work on them together with some kind of overarching reasonable standards. Bruce doesn't want that. The academic integral professor doesn't want that, doesn't want fair, overarching, reasonable standards. He wants to criticize people who want that in favor of these people who are making bold, unfounded, religiously based claims in a cult of personality. And then we're still supposed to see him as some kind of a non-biased, academically grounded professor. I think it's very clear that Bruce is very biased, and it's not in the direction of anything reasonable or rational or grounded. This is why I don't fuck with Bruce Alderman anymore, by the way. And this is why I'm also getting tired of his bullshit critiques, is because they don't even seem like they're coming from a place of caring about what's actually true and good. It's more like a political thing where he wants to maintain his power position of the authority on integral because I threaten that. And he wants to maintain his goodwill towards the integral orthodoxy, the Ken Wilber and the Corey and the integral life and all this. He's trying to set himself up in some kind of a position politically. And that's why he goes after me. Not because it's the good thing to do, but because it's the good thing to do for Bruce. I don't respect that at all. This is a big problem with academia in general. There's a lack of care for truth and integrity, and more of a creating of common space and building allegiances and posturing and trying to set yourself up in some kind of politically good position. It's more about politics and rhetoric than it is about what's actually good and true. That's what I see in this shit. That's why I think Bruce is constantly coming after me. And he's like, David, how dare you be so arrogant as to claim that your view is the correct one, right? But then he has no problem with integral out here making these bold, unfounded claims they can't even begin to justify and saying their view is the correct one. He already knows they're wrong, and he kind of knows I'm right, and yet he goes after me in public. What you're seeing is not really honest or in good faith from Bruce. To be properly post-metaphysical, yes, you want to be continually in dialogue with empirical science and to hold philosophical claims provincially, subject to revision or reframing in the light of new scientific findings. But this is also not a matter of philosophical theories being intrinsically inferior to scientific ones or superfluous. Both philosophical theories and scientific ones are needed, I would argue, for the progress and refinement of knowledge. Agreed, they're both important, but obviously having the evidence for something, as I have already demonstrated, trumps just musing about what might be the most probable explanation for something. Deductive reasoning trumps inductive reasoning, a valid scientific theory trumps a hypothesis, and a hypothesis is better than unfounded claims. I'm calling all three of these criticisms undone, not really relevant. In summation, if you want to claim that your idea is rational, I want to see you make a ground-up rational case. And I'm not even asking for empirical evidence. I'm just asking for a logical case to your position. If you can't make a logical ground-up case, to your position, you don't have a reasonable view. If you don't value the project of having to support your ideas reasonably, you're not a reasonable person. If you don't value this project, then you don't value epistemic humility enough, you don't value truth enough, and you don't value goodness enough. You're probably putting your own personal bullshit ahead of what's actually good and true. And that's a problem. We need to be able to establish things to be able to build together. We won't be able to do any of these integral projects if we can't come to some kind of agreements around topics like this. And part of that means that we at least need to be able to set up some kind of fair overarching criteria to engage with, to be able to say what is reasonable and what is not. If you can't solve any actual real world problems or come to any real world conclusions, then this whole philosophical project is just masturbatory. If you actually care about the world and what's good and true, then you should care about challenges and projects and criteria and boundaries like this. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this talk. We'll see you next time. Peace.